How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Ganji. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, we have a great topic today, a very serious topic. It's going to be concerns that can cause inmate unity. We have a few things that we're going to mention, and then we're going to talk about ways to intervene in the process. It's going to be a great dialogue. My guest today is going to be Russ Hamilton. Guys, the biggest threat in corrections is when inmates unite. Whether it is a dynamic that already exists, and we'll go over that like gangs, or it could be a dynamic that gets created or formed, and we'll go over like maybe shared grievances. But this is something that it's very important that we monitor, and I feel that this topic that me and Russ are going to discuss today will provide some insight and maybe even go over some types that you guys may not even have thought of. Because we dug deep on this one. Real quick before I bring in Russ, guys, don't forget I have some books on the market. Inmate Manipulation Decoded and Breaking Boundaries, 2 great books on manipulation available now on Amazon, linked in the description. And then I got 5 books out there on Blue 360 Media, linked to all those in the description, including report writing, books on leadership, books on just being new in the profession, books on managing inmate behavior, especially those that are on the more problematic side. But if you guys get a chance, please check out those books. All right, let me get Russ. What up, Russ?
Hey there, Anthony. How's it going?
Good. Hey, Russ, you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Russ Hamilton. I am a former and retired sergeant from the California Department of Corrections. Started at San Quentin back in the late 80s. I've also worked as a senior juvenile correctional officer, and I currently work for a private company where we do re-entry and rehabilitation work at a county jail where I am a case manager and also for a local probation department. I'm also the founder of Keepers of Chaos, and I'm often found here with Anthony on Cheer Talk.
Yes, and we love having you. Now, guys, granted, as we get to a little later in the show, there are positive forms of inmate unity, so we don't want to make it look like that inmates aren't supposed to have a voice. But with that said, unfortunately, a majority of the time, the biggest concern we have is when they do unite on something that is really not for proper cause. And that's what we're going to kind of discuss. So Russ, I do think this is a very important topic, Russ, because I think this, most of the time, yes, we may have problems with inmates, but it's never really grouped. It's usually maybe 1, 2, or 3. But when we start seeing that the population is starting to group and starting to have common causes, that's a problem that hits us at every level of operations. Would you agree?
Yeah, there's a few different things, that really make this up. I think the one that I see, and we'll go into maybe at the end if we don't hit the ones that I usually think of when we talk about unity, are things that allow them to share a common bond and a common source of outrage, a common source of being offended, if you will, and that has the ability to stoke some pretty volatile and pretty dangerous situations, and those are things that we always have to be on the lookout for. Other than that, sometimes there are some more spontaneous forms of this, which occur usually, that happen perhaps within the confines of another incident. Someone has a conflict with a staff member and there's a use of force. Sometimes that will cause them to rise up, if you will, and to do things, from a unified perspective. So all of those things together, I think we're going to take a pretty deep dive in this. If there's anything left over at the end, we'll address that, but let's get to it.
Yeah. And guys, I kind of thought that we can maybe add, when we're talking about what causes inmate unity, I mean, there's stuff that, as I said, can form, and there's stuff that may already exist that you got to be mindful of. But I assume the universal precaution here when it comes to unity is to always assume that there could be a united front, just to, be wary. because at any moment, as I said, the inmates could unite. You just don't know. So you got to always be cautious of group gatherings, and really be vigilant. But I also want to mention another thing before we get into this is the layout of the unit itself also matters. Like, I mean, I get some people could be working in pods where, maybe it's 2 to a cell, locked down. But again, if you have a whole mess of them in one area, that let's say gangs, that could be an issue. But my big concern is when you're working those minimum units and you got inmates in dorms and there's really no obstruction. So even though we're going to talk about the group dynamics that can cause unity, sometimes you could work in a unit that doesn't obstruct unity. So that's a bigger concern too. So now you got the motivation to unite within a unit that really doesn't have any obstacles against inmate unity. So I wanted to make sure that gets mentioned. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, all of those, are things that, can add or subtract from the temperature of the unit or the facility that you're at the time. I've seen and been in situations that were, really, quite, let's say, volatile, especially, in those large, extra large, sometimes dorms. I was in a dorm one time, and I think there was 300. I think there was 300 in that dorm. And boy, the least little thing, could set them off, and you could, end up with, some kind of a, necessary response and having to get guns in there and everything. And it was, really quite a dangerous place to work. And so the last thing you want is all of them on the same page. You want all of them to be worried about themselves between each other, various factions, and definitely not focused on staff, because staff, needless to say, we're the smallest number in there.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'll tell you one of the biggest things. So we're going to go right to number one. One of the biggest things that I look for is management. Definitely because I may have more oversight over on this, because I may oversee the grievance system, is the shared grievances. Now, I think this is a dynamic of unity that can form. I think this is something, if you don't monitor, can easily cause inmates to unite that usually don't, communicate with each other, but through a shared grievance that's not being addressed, a grievance. And when I talk about a grievance, I mean a grievance that has validity. And anything common from complaints about food, treatment, or privileges can foster solidarity. So, like, I know my biggest, I'll just give an example. If I start getting complaints, let's say just in general, guys, throw it out there. Let's say you get complaints about a staff member, an officer that's kind of going rogue. Maybe the first time it's like, okay, maybe you give the officer the benefit of the doubt because, they are in trusted positions. And, sometimes inmates, they don't like the officers that tend to do their job. Some inmates don't. But you get an officer that's on point. So you expect good officers to get grievances. But sometimes there could be a pattern. And sometimes you get maybe the same officer getting grievances from a different unit, from different inmates. And then all of a sudden it starts to mount up. I'm not saying the officer is automatically wrong, but it's definitely something where you may want to start looking into, because you don't know. Maybe you do have an officer or a staff member that's gone a little rogue. And now the problem is that it's connecting all the inmates now, because all the inmates are now maybe voicing their concerns. And let's say in this case, for this scenario, it's legit. They're expecting for these concerns to be addressed. They're expecting for the officer to be spoken to. Now, if there is no action, however superficial or if needed, the inmates may feel that the grievance system isn't working. So the next thing they do is they look to unite and have their voice heard outside of the grievance system. And now what they start doing is they start grouping together. And then let's say when the supervisors come in, they start trying to talk to the supervisors. And now if the supervisors aren't listening and they're trying to voice their concern, well, the next bet could be is that they try to get their concern out through action, which is basically like, hey, we gave ample time to go through the system to get this issue resolved. We even tried talking to the supervisors in a group, as a group, all connected on this one concern. It hasn't been addressed. And I'm not justifying it, but the next step will be, well, you know what? Now we're going to be heard. And now we're going to be a bit disruptive, because now that's something that you're going to have to hear, because it will mess with operations. And I think that's kind of how that sort of evolves to some extent. So as management, as supervisors on the floor, I always tell people, be wary of patterns of grievances that could have validity or have validity. What's your thoughts on that, Russ, being observant of patterns of grievances?
Yeah, you want to look at at the patterns just in case something is developing, but you also have to be cognizant of the fact that that the grievances that they're talking about, or the grievances that they're actually filing and stuff, don't necessarily have to have a component that's connected to something that's real and tangible. Things will often get blown out of proportion. Things will often be misreported. Things will often make the rounds as gossip within the confines of a unit. And sometimes ordinary stories that have no validity will still piss a bunch of people off, because they tend to go in there and they assume that it's true. And so sometimes you really get all of this this formed fuel that's given off, all these, danger signs and warning signs. And it only takes one spark after that to get it going. And so just remember that, just because they don't have a real issue doesn't mean that the issue is not real to them. And I think that that's one thing that you always want to look at. And, the things that I tend to think about with regards to the shared grievances, and I hope I'm not going to bleed over into some other stuff we're going to go into here. But the way that I've seen it historically is, I think number one is generally, food issues. Man, if they're not getting, good and hefty amounts of at least somewhat decent food, that can really be a potential spark, especially if it lasts over a little bit of time. But even a single meal that's not good. I had an incident at San Quentin where there were some pieces of barbed wire and some rocks and some beans. And boy, that thing just almost completely touched off. I was able to rein it back in and kind of work the issue a little bit. But that, and another time, some spoiled milk. I mean, I thought in that one that there was a good chance that I was going to have to take a beating. So all of these things combined, you have to be on top of it, and you have to understand it from both a real and a perceived perspective.
Yeah, and Russ, I do have gossip later on. I definitely want to. That inmate pipeline is a killer sometimes.
Yes.
Which is something that gets put out there, and then all of a sudden, seconds later, it's already out of control. Like it's like they said what, and then by the time you get back on the compound, it goes so quick, man. From unit to unit, it's insanely fast. I have that though. I do. I took note of that. The signs to watch out for something like this are going to be frequent discussions about grievances, visible frustration, or meetings of inmates who don't usually interact. For me, that's the biggest concern. That's one of the things I can actually see. Now, well, wait, actually, let me reverse that. Hold on. So when you're in the unit, or when you're a supervisor and you're working the floor, you may be able to see inmates that don't normally interact with each other now interacting. I think that's something to pay note to within any context. But I know on the management side, when you're seeing the grievance, I sometimes connect inmates that don't usually connect with each other by what they're grieving about. And then I see the connection over what they're grieving about. So I see it a bit differently. So if I'm getting the same complaints about one thing from inmates that don't normally interact, there's a pattern. I may want to look into that, and I can easily find out. I can go to the person running the unit, the supervisor, and say, "Hey, do you know these guys? Yeah. Hey, do these guys communicate with each other? No. Why? What's going on? Well, they seem to have this. Everybody seems to have the same problem with this one thing. So maybe you want to talk to them individually and see if it's something that we need to handle. Now, granted, when we talk about dynamics that can form and dynamics that exist, I think a good way of putting it, if maybe we could filter it this way, is dynamics that can form is maybe something that we have more of a handle on. And because we're negligent with it, we're letting it form. Where dynamics that already exist means it's going to exist. Our job now is to maybe not let it get too strong or intervene when necessary. Like gangs are going to exist. Yeah, I wish I could tell Russ, hey, go on your post one day and stop the gangs from uniting. It's not going to happen. But our job at that point is going to be to either you don't want to maintain the unity, but you want to kind of intervene when you feel the odds are going too far towards one side. So the intervention here is proactively address grievances, which we talked about, maintain open channels for legitimate complaints, and monitor any escalated tension. One last thing, Russ, I got to ask you a question. As a supervisor on the floor, you know, you're the ears and the eyes of what's happening. So I think when inmates do have a certain complaint and they go to the officer and the officer is just kind of, kind of lets it go, but it could be legit. They are going to go to that supervisor. And if that supervisor fails to kind of, maybe at least look into it, do a little due diligence, I think that's where you could see that problem start to escalate, where now, once they start going up to management, the first thing I would ask is this: is management, hear me out. If I see simple problems that could be handled on the floor, I know inmates try to circumvent. I get it. So I'm not a fool. I know when I'm reading the grievances that inmates are going to go up as high up as they can. But sometimes you got basic things that are happening on the floor that really should be solved at a supervisory level. So now, granted, one person may come up with that little grievance. Okay, if that's one person, maybe it's, just a perspective that they have. The officer's harassing him. Maybe not. Maybe the inmate just has a perspective of that because the officer's doing their job. But now you get a pattern from different inmates of something that's now starting to evolve. And now it's flooding the grievance system. So we're talking about something that could be legit. The first thing I do as management is when I start seeing these complaints coming in at that level, and let's say it turns out to be legit, but it's something that the inmates are documenting, one, for whatever liability it may be, or they're also documenting, I brought it to this supervisor, and I brought it to this supervisor, and then I went to a lieutenant, and they're documenting that chain up, and it turns out to be legit. We go right back down to that immediate supervisor, not even the officer. We go to that immediate supervisor, and we're like, hey, you've been brought up in all these complaints. They're all going to you, and these seem to be legit. And right now there doesn't seem to be an action on your end as to, what are the efforts to try to resolve it? Because right now the inmate population is now flooding us. And now the bigger concern is because you haven't even made an attempt to address it. You got a whole unit that's getting ready to do their, to do like a unified, let's say, hunger strike, which to me, it may sound superficial at first, but it's not, because a hunger strike shows a very coordinated, organized effort. And at that point there's leadership there that you're going to want to go ahead and nip. But I sometimes you got to go back to that supervisor saying, hey, all these inmates are saying they brought this to you. It's something that you as a supervisor could have addressed and you haven't. And now we're being flooded. So I think the supervisors, the initial supervisors, that sergeant, the front line, play a very important role in doing what they can to make sure that these grievances that should be handled are handled. I mean, would you agree to that as playing that initial frontline supervisor?
Yeah. So you want to do everything that you can. Number one, to empower and encourage your officers to go ahead and take care of things. I mean, that's really what we want to do. Is we want to destroy any chance of giving them a structure to build a grievance around. And so that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is that there's a talk and a class that I've given many times about inmate unity. And I think number 4 on my list in that particular talk is one of the things that inmates will rally around is the lack of a robust grievance system with due process built in. And so when you have a situation like that, and an inmate and number of inmates believe that there's no chance for a redress of their grievances, that can spike something in and of itself. So it's not just enough to be talking about what grievances they have, but that's a whole other thing in and of itself when they believe that there's no way to get their grievances redressed. So that's the 2 things that I look at in order to try and, keep unity from building, if you will.
Yeah, I love that. And Russ, I love what you said about the due process, because I always try to reinforce the due process by making sure that the inmates go through that chain of command. But when they're documenting who they're seeing, and and it's not just from one person saying it, but you got a group of them saying, we saw this person at this time, this is where they saw them, very specific. At this point here, it may require to bring that supervisor up and say, hey, listen, are you aware of these concerns, and what are we doing to address it? Or, do I got to get somebody else to look at that? And you don't want somebody else, because basically I'm telling you that you're not being effective.
Yeah, essentially, you really do want your grievance system to work for the inmates, because when it works for the inmates, it actually works for us, because it does help tamp down and mitigate that unity. And we don't want all of these little petty things to become something that eventually gets label attached to it, like Attica. You know what I mean? It's scary. So these are things, I mean, we're by no means, hug a thug or anything like that. There is a good reason for having a good grievance system.
Yeah, and it gives you a lot of information going on in the compound too. Let's not lie.
Yes.
And it has to be a secured path. So I got mutual protection packs. I kind of left it separate from the gangs, because I kind of use the gangs as a shared culture or identity bond, even though gangs could be a form of protection. But I kind of put gangs as the primary shared culture or identity bond, where I did separate mutual protection packs, because I figured mutual protection packs could fall into just different group dynamics, or you even have inmates that technically sell their services. Gangs could do that too. Old versus young could be another one, where the old are getting together to protect each other from the young. So I took this as an existing group dynamic, I think, because there's a lot of stuff happening on the floor that's just how the culture is in the prison. I mean, yes, we could intervene if it goes too far one side or the other, but this is a survival thing. At the end of the day, what are you going to do? Separate everyone? No, you're going to have to know that there are going to be dynamics where you could have an us versus them right in the same unit, and you're going to have to find a way just to manage it. So I got mutual protection packs. I got established alliances, provide mutual protection, and often enforce an internal code of conduct. So the signs I had for here, Russ, was protective behaviors, like inmates standing guard for each other or avoiding certain areas. And then the intervention is separate known group members as needed, adjust housing to prevent dangerous alliances, and maintain detailed logs of inmates and interpersonal conflicts. The funny thing about that is, even when you work in the gang realm, Russ, we'll get to gangs. I have something I want to mention there, but just to put in the back of our minds so we don't forget. The funny thing about this all here is that you also can't have opposing gangs technically running around the same unit either. That's harder for the officer to control. So sometimes the officer always has the odds against them, which means that you got to make the effort to protect the inmates. So now you wind up having one area, predominantly one set of gangs that get along, that work well. And then the officer seriously is going to be outnumbered automatically. You're not going to try to put two opposing groups, because then the officer is going to be handling fights. So the officers that work these units could be working units amongst already a united force, because you don't want to have the conflict, even though they do have that internal beef. But have you dealt with mutual protection packs?
Yeah, they kind of break down mostly along. Well, see, I don't want to say it's all STG lines. They tend to break down amongst kind of different ethnic lines, but the ethnic lines kind of tend to conform, to some other kind of geographical or cultural things. Because sometimes you'll run into situations, where you'll have some Crips or you have some Bloods, and in a lot of areas, what you really don't want to have is you don't want to, try and cede one area to one specific gang. I know years ago, even before I got there at San Quentin, they had kind of like segregated most of the population into tiers. And so, you would have, BGF on a tier and Bloods on a tier and Crips on a tier. And then, Aryan Brotherhood on a tier. And it just made it so if an officer was, in trouble with one person on the tier, he was in trouble with everyone on the tier. And it was really detrimental. And you actually wanted to try and, not have that happen. You wanted to have them, at least living in peace until the time where, they do end up attacking each other. And, it just happens. And it's kind of a cyclical thing. Most areas, what you tend to see is they break up in their little areas, out on the yard, and they kind of, protect and control those. Oh, but it's just problematic to try and have, too much of one STG controlling too much of an area for the officers involved. I think I kind of got off on a rant on that, but yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I know. Like, yeah, 'cause we got the gangs as the next one, but they kind of blend into here. But I know you could have two cellmates very protective of each other. So officer may have a problem with Russ, and then Joe and Russ have developed a bond. And then sometimes people think,
And
oh, let's put father and son together because I'm sure they can help each other. And it's like, yeah, what help each other? How? I got a problem with the son. Who do you think's going to come at me? Or if I have a problem with the father, who's going to come at me? So I know some people think rehabilitation. If we could put family members together, put them together, yeah. But now the officers at tremendous odds if they have a problem with one of the inmates, because you're going to assume that the other inmate, because relative or not, is probably going to wind up assisting the inmate that you have an issue with. What are you going to say, Russ?
and you got to, yeah, I was going to say you got to understand too, that you have all of these, guys out on the yard together, and certain elements of them, whether it's gangs or whether it's ethnicities or older, whatever way that they break off amongst each other and they hang around each other, it fosters this dynamic where they start to look out for each other. Their own little cliques break off, and then anyone gets chesty with them, they get chesty right back, and there's fights and stuff. So then when you have, some small little group or big group or whatever that has a problem with an officer, the rest of them are already pre-programmed into that way of thinking. And from their perspective, it's always us versus them. And from their perspective, yeah, it's them versus this gang and the other gang and also the officers and whoever else. And that just becomes the way that they become programmed to reacting within the system. And I don't know that there's a lot that you can do about that other than really being on top of your gang and trying to, keep those dynamics from developing too deeply.
Yeah, and sometimes the culture in the prison, because you have the insiders. So you have, let's say, the guys that are in the gangs or females, whatever, but they got their little groups. But then in the process, they're pushing people out, and those people in survival mode could be forming their own groups. May not be, it's being because now they're in survival mode. So now you got unidentified cliques because they're being threatened by the identified cliques. So the insiders versus the outsiders. And you're right, the officers are in the middle of all that. As I said, I put here, as I said, just mutual protection packs. I've seen it. I've seen two older inmates play chess. They become buddies, and then the one guy gets loud, and the officer goes to address him, and the other inmate, sneaks up behind and takes the officer out. And the only relationship they have is in the routine of playing chess every day. I mean, that's another thing, as I said, you got to be wary of is that, I know a good senior officer who taught me years ago that, you got to know who inmates interact with. So it goes outside of what they represent. I could be a blood, let's just say whatever set, and Russ could be a crypt. But that doesn't mean all the time that, the gang's going to come to our rescue, whatever set. And Russ, Russ could be also my brother. And at that point, the gangs don't matter. That's my brother. So it's good to understand not just what they represent, but the relationships that they have with each other, with the inmates, because in some cases, gangs may be rival, but then they may set aside things to get some business in the prison. And next thing you know, you may say, well, those two are on opposite sides. Maybe not. Maybe they developed a relationship in the prison that, it could put the officers at risk. As I said, you never know who can come to an inmate's aid. So the officer had said to me, the senior officer had said, just understand the relationship, the dynamic. And that goes way beyond just you labeling who belongs in a what gang. It goes beyond like, hey, these two hang out all the time. Yeah, they remember this, but these two are inseparable, or this group here is not as tight as they should be. So they may not stand up for each other as much. That kind of brings us. Does that make sense for us at all?
Yeah. There's no way that we can touch on every single dynamic. So you have to be aware of all the dynamics that exist outside of what we're saying right now. And so just know that, there's going to be things that we couldn't possibly, see from our perspective, but you see them from your perspective, investigate it, learn about it, figure it out. That's what being a good correctional officer is all about.
Yeah, like as I said, you're bringing. I get, it's good to see good, healthy relationships, but at any point, those relationships could go sour towards us. So it's good to see who is with who. I remember working at the female facility, and we were very adamant of keeping track of. I know a lot of people want to keep track of gangs and stuff like that, but at the female facility, we were very active in keeping track of couples. Because couples were more likely to be the problem, than it was gangs. Gang ties were secondary compared to a loving relationship. So if I had a problem with Russ, I would need to know, well, is Russ dating somebody in this facility? You're going to have a problem with that person almost immediately. The female facility had more of a family dynamic. Okay, so we kind of touched on it, but we'll revisit a little bit. I got shared culture or identity bonds, which I believe kind of exists going in, whether it's just the label of the group that you're connected to, whatever the higher affiliation would be. So whatever subset of a blood set or of a Crip set or whatever other group, or other identifying bonds. Like Russ had mentioned before, in California, they're very big on ethnicity. So again, those are things that already exist coming in. So I have for gangs and ethnic alliances, I have longstanding alliances based on gang or ethnic ties. That always requires constant observation because it exists. It exists. Like Russ said, you can see how they situate themselves. So that you have to always watch that because that's in existence. And I got the signs for that. It's just group exclusive gatherings, distinct dress or symbols or patterns of isolation. I mean, back in the day, out in Chicago or whatever, you had out in Illinois, you had those folk and people gangs that, the higher affiliation inside the prison, where, you had these little street beefs going on, out in Chicago, whatever it is. And then eventually when they got into the prison setting, they developed nations, people and folk, and they adopted cultures that were similar. So you would have like two little small groups. They would fall into this higher nation, this people nation or folk nation, and they would adopt either the right or left side. So people started to identify them by, right or left side or numbers, 5 versus 6. And it made it easier for staff to kind of okay, this one belongs here, this one belongs there, because they had to promote that. But that has lessened a lot. So now you don't see the clothing so much or the identifying mark. So now it's basically what I like, what Russ said, is the observation of who they're hanging out with, who they're sitting with, and then kind of guilty by association, unfortunately. And then the signs, the intervention part would be enforce anti-gang policies, discourage exclusive grouping, and engage in regular gang affiliation checks. That makes sense. I mean, I mean, we back in years ago, even when I first started, people were wearing the marks. But now when they got the gang affiliated crimes, a lot of people try to hide their affiliations. So now it's really about it's on the officer and their observations to see who's connected. And sadly, it's like, hey, you may not have any gang identifiers, but every day you're out there with that group. So it's kind of safe to say, whether you say you're not or you are, whatever it is, I'm putting you with them. Would you agree, Russ, at that level?
Yeah, but that's just, our kind of our own internal thing. It's a completely different thing if we're talking about, doing a validation on someone. But for the most part, in these prisons, especially in the prisons, because there tends to be, mostly lower number inside the jails. It's obvious because when you go out there, you just know that hey, this is where the Sureños hang out. This is where the Norteños hang out. This is where the Border Brothers are. This is where the white guys are. And Bloods and Crips and everything else that you've got out there. So they're gonna let you know what their affiliation is. They're not gonna come up and tell you, but they're gonna let you know by where they're hanging out. And then if we start seeing these guys that are ostensibly not necessarily enemies, but they're at least at odds. Let's say Bloods and Crips, for instance. And suddenly, they're a little bit more chummy with each other than usual. Well, maybe they got a drug deal going on, or maybe they're getting ready to do something kind of crazy because they are uniting against staff. And so that's the kind of thing you just have to be cognizant of in the moment.
Yeah, and guys, this is real quick. This is such a tricky thing to manage because this is a dynamic that already exists. So I really lean on my officers on this, where if they are working in a unit that has some gang ties, I usually ask them or work with them in classification to see where you want them placed in that unit strategically. Like Russ said, you don't want them all in one area. But sometimes the facilities will actually separate the different groups already for you. So maybe one facility is known for housing these factions that seem to get along, and this facility may house these factions that seem to get along. For the most part, once in a while, someone does sneak in that really shouldn't be there. But how you manage that on the unit really the officers really put at a disadvantage here, because the priority should always be safety of staff. And safety of staff does come with the managing of that group dynamic. I mean, you don't want staff to be responding to codes between two warring factions and in the process get killed. So we want to try to have some peace. But with that said, the effort to put peace can also be overwhelming, where the officer is now walking onto a unit that they're severely outnumbered, and the dynamic for the unity is already there because it exists within the culture of the gang or the ethnicity, as we mentioned. And now imagine on top of that, putting them into a layout where there's no obstacles, no obstructions to, I may put the inmates in certain areas, but that day room's out, and then there's just nothing stopping these inmates from connecting and doing their business. So it's a really crazy trade-off. What do you got, Russ? You got something?
Oh no, I'm just listening to you. But yeah, and all these things are just stuff that you should, this is a good lesson that should be corrections 101, but sometimes you don't really start thinking about this stuff until you're a little further along in your career. But when you're out there in the dorms, on the yard, in the cell blocks, in the dining halls, this is where you need to be very aware of how people can come together and rise up and get you, because I've had it happen. inside of a dining hall before. One occasion, especially, probably involved 40 or 50 inmates trying to get me.
Yeah, and Russ, what's funny? If I was back on the floor, and I haven't been on the floor, I mean, as an officer for over almost a decade now, I've been managing prison. So I remember being a sergeant, having to walk the floor of an open dorm, which did have a mixture of gangs that were positioned, a little grouped, to kind of keep some peace there. It wasn't as it was a maximum security facility, but it wasn't a wild one. It was very well managed. But I will tell you one thing I learned pretty quick. You do have to manage the group, but I have to say you also can get really good with managing the individual that belongs to the group. And I think that's where you need the insight from the people that work the floor, because maybe at the higher level we see the bigger picture. So we may see the group dynamic, but the people that work the floor see the individual. And I think they kind of get an understanding of how to manage the individual on a very, I guess you want to say, a micro level, and then the macro level is managing the group. So I think if you have a good person on the floor, they know how to manage the individual to such a point that it manages the group, if that makes sense. I think that does carry a lot of weight. I have this as something that can already exist, but can definitely form deeper ties if it's not monitored well, and that's the religious and ideological groupings. So unity can form around shared beliefs, especially if inmates feel these beliefs are being disrespected. So the signs to watch for are religious gatherings with growing attendance, increased cohesion among ideological grounds, and then the intervention is support healthy expressions of faith, encourage diversity within religious activities, and observe any exclusionary behaviors. Because granted, a lot of the gang stuff could be hidden under what they feel is a protective right of religion. So with that said, you got to be on top of making sure that the religion itself is not being bastardized to support groupings for nefarious reasons.
Right.
What's your thought on that, Russ?
So that especially, I don't have as much experience with problems with religious groups, except maybe episodically. But I would say that where you look for these ideological groupings, that can be especially dangerous, because some of those groups already figure to have a beef with authority of any kind. When I think back, like on, for instance, let's just take the Bloods and the Crips, right? There's nothing really very ideological about them, right? They're down for their hood, their little area or whatever. They don't get along with each other in prison. Sometimes they might have problems with certain officers and things, but not a big deal. But when you hearken back, especially like if you look at things through the lens of like, the 70s and the 80s and even the early 90s, you take a group like the Black Guerrilla family, for instance, they were not a street gang in any sense of the words. They had an ideological facet to them, which predominantly flowed out of communism and specifically Maoist. And so for those years in the penitentiaries in California, they were responsible for killing more staff than any other type of gang was. And so they were very, very much involved in type of, the rebellion, slam it to the man, kind of, just radicalized. And so that was a potential, problem at those times, and that they were inflamed very easily, and they had a very deep unity because this was not just about street level crimes. This was about an ideology that drove them to do the things that they did. not as individuals, but as parts of a larger group. And so we have to watch out for those things happening. There's some facets. I think that's probably the best example that I know of, and the group that I've had the most interactions with to be able to talk about that. But I'm certain that there's others out there, and it's something that you should just be aware of and know, because you never know when some group might become, politically active in a way that grows their membership in a way that causes certain individuals to want to show their fealty and their loyalty to the group.
Yeah, and I also think also the further you remove from the origin, so again, maybe in the late 60s, you see the Crips, early 70s, you start seeing the development of Bloods. They travel street by street technically, and they take owners to their neighborhoods, their why they originated, survival mode. And but the years pass, and eventually people they're not really connected to the history. They just represent the name. They don't really, you start questioning some of them about the history of why it formed, and a lot of them don't know it. They just want to be connected to the name. I think on the East Coast, it was a lot more difficult because the Bloods and Crips we have here are more hybrid, kind of a mixture of West Coast and Midwest ideology, but it spread so much quicker here on the East Coast because they started in the prison system. They don't claim streets. They claim like sex, money, murder, and 9/3, the year it formed, and then it spreads out because once they're in prison, they go back to their own homes, and they all just kind of spread out. So on the East Coast, it spread very, very quick. Where on the West Coast, it was like block by block, But I agree. I think for the most part, you do have the gangs that kind of hide behind a strong either ethnic component or a religious component. And now you're connected to a belief that they will not allow to be disrespected at any sense or form. So most of the time, even with like the gangs, like whatever subset, Bloods, Crips, it's more of a disrespect to like the individual, that may claim a set. But when you're talking about like, the 5%ers or even BGF at one point, their formation was a bit stronger because they had a cause, or they believed they had a cause. And I think now still, if the officers know how to work with the individuals, especially in these settings, they do make a lot of ground in kind of controlling to some extent that group dynamic. But that religion, as I said, the religious aspect is hard because the people that usually are able to unite those inmates, they have a strong voice. They know exactly how to get dominance through religion. They know how to speak word that they connect to, that already connects to an already established belief. So that's the thing. It's like they know how to connect to these individuals that heightens their belief in who they are as through them. And then again, if you got someone that has that powerful voice and you're giving them center stage, man, you better be observing that, because at any time, if it goes sideways and you're allowing these group activities to happen in these secured areas like the chapel or whatnot, you're going to come down to a rude awakening when you're going to see like they're able to get a whole, listen, these religious movements can turn rival gangs together. I think, to be honest with you, Russ, the power of these religious movements actually create a more power dynamic than the gangs, because the reason why I'm thinking of it is if played out right, the gangs, I know there's a loyalty, but most of them don't break away because of self-survival. I can't leave if I wanted to because they're going to kill me. The religious side is usually just more about a belief that they foster, so the loyalty may be a bit greater. I think when it forms on a backbone of religion or something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you'll see too. There's been, over the last several decades, there's been like kind of a hybridization of some of these elements, and you'll see it. I think of when I think of like some of the skinhead things that you see with regards to these guys, and certain other elements like Christian identity kind of, a harbinger over, some elements of that, trying to strengthen the commitment of people, through a hybridization of the religion and gang aspects. You've seen it some, in some of the Muslim religious aspects being adopted by, especially, some of the Black groups, even some of the Crips and Bloods and things like that. So yeah, it's remember at all times these groups are attempting to hold as much sway over as many individuals as possible, and that's helpful in that regard from their viewpoint.
Yeah, and that's good that we mentioned that, guys. I know a lot of people may think that they hide the religion because they hide behind religion because it's a good way they feel that they can protect their identity, but also the religion can reinforce the group because the religion could be the backbone of how they're pushing their beliefs, like Russ said, white supremacy through Christianity or Odinism. Okay, so we have the contraband networks, which is something that I know people may not think about, but it's true. It's something that could already exist. Remember, it's a lucrative market in the prison setting. So you got trade and barter and create dependency networks, often controlled by influential inmates. The signs are suspicious item transfers, sudden access to extra resources, or inmates who avoid searches. And then obviously conduct your regular searches, monitor inmates with suspected involvement in contraband distribution, and limit opportunities for trading. Guys, this is easy one. Contraband networks, a chance for them to make money. So you know that I have seen, as I said, warring factions connect because they figure instead of us rivaling against each other and it's going to mess with the money, let's bring it together. As I said, back in the 70s, you're going to see that with the small little groups in Chicago that were at constant war with each other, that they wind up when they were in the prison setting. You had two rival gangs, would be Larry Hoover, David Barksdale representing the folk nation, but more so the Black Gangster Disciples. And then you had the Black Pistone, El Rukin, what was that, Jeff Fort. And they were like, listen, we got all these little groups here. They're basically destroying any chance to become lucrative here. So either we're going to limit it down to two factions, people and folk. And basically we're going to eliminate a lot of these street beefs. Now, by the way, if they go back out in the street, technically that folk and people nation really shouldn't carry any weight. It was only put in the prison to divide all these little groups into two bigger factions. Very smart business move, by the way. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, but having said that, it became a contraband network. That's what it was. And they knew that it was more lucrative to go ahead and work together and get the money. So you saw these rival gangs that wouldn't get along on the streets either choose a side. I'm going to rep the 5 or I'm going to rep the 6. And basically that was a way to kind of control, whatever dynamic it was to make money behind the prison. And Russ, I'm sure you've seen that on the maybe something with the Serenos and the ABs or the Norteños and the Nuestra and the BGF at one point.
Yeah, because that was kind of the breakdown, the NF and the BGF, allied together, and then you had the Aryan Brotherhood and the Serenos very much allied together. But then you also had the Crips and Bloods running around doing their own thing, and then some other bygone ones that we really kind of quit seeing in the CDC system. Like we no longer. I knew probably in my whole time maybe like 3 or 4 different Texas syndicate guys, and that was about it really. And then you saw other factions form. You had the Nazi lowriders who were part of the Aryan Brotherhood, but it was just a label change because so much of the Aryan Brotherhood got locked up. And then you saw all of the Nazi lowriders get locked up because they were deemed a prison gang then. And so then they broke off and they formed, PDS, Penal Death Squad. And, there's just all these different factions, and they're all trying to get over on each other. And then sometimes they come together for mutual benefit, and then sometimes they don't. And so, and it's I mean, it's really fascinating to watch as it plays out. But you have to really watch it because it can be ultimately destructive to yourself.
Yeah, and it's funny because so even if we have peaceful groups getting along and it's quiet, you still got to be aware of the fact that they could be, working together to, I guess, increase contraband or whatever. I mean, there's always something behind everything. But I think that's something that staff they may only be aware of if you actually see these offshoot relationships behind the prison setting. Like if all of a sudden you see two factions that really shouldn't be getting along, but not as individuals, but more as groups. You know what I mean? I think more as group settings. And it's like, oh, well, it's peaceful. Let's keep them together. Yeah, guys, just be wary because you may think on the surface it's peaceful, but there's something happening underneath the surface that may cause some chaos later on down the line. I got also group building activities. I thought this was unique. I put work details and recreation. So I put this down as that conform. So again, when I say that it conformed, it's something that you should monitor. You don't want to be negligent at, not watching these groups. So I said, while these activities can be positive, they can also form alliances because there's always people that could join for nefarious reasons. So the signs to watch for inmates consistently sticking together during activities or private conversations, and the intervention would be vary group assignments, rotate work or recreational pairing, and maintain a visible staff presence. I mean, we try to rotate jobs as much as we can. You don't want someone in a job too long. One is because the routine staff can sometimes fall complacent to having to deal with someone, every day through the course of however 10, 15 years. So you rotate maybe the jobs that the inmates have if you can. But again, it's a group setting. Imagine if you're, on an outside detail and you're monitoring a work detail, maybe 5, 10 inmates, whatever it is. And, they're starting to build in some group. Now imagine the officer is by themselves, technically, or hopefully they're not, but the way the world's going right now, they could be. So you could have the whole workforce because, like, let's say I'm an officer and hopefully I have a partner, but I've seen it where they don't. And we go out on a trip and all of a sudden there's some contraband that's on the road that the inmates are trying to get to. And all of a sudden I'm by myself. I mean, am I going to address these inmates and get that contraband? Or are they going to stop me from wanting to address them because now they know that they're all going to get in trouble for it? So, I mean, it's even that moment could present an opportunity for the inmates to say, yo, you're not getting that contraband. And it could be a bit of a ruckus. I mean, I've seen staff that are extremely courageous on those details where they got those inmates out there in the middle of nowhere doing whatever work they got to do. And there's someone driving by that throws something out the road, however, if it was planned or not, and staff will still do their job and grab that contraband, knowing that at any point that could be a big risk because the inmates may feel that, we want that contraband. That contraband's got to come in. We're all being pressured to bring that contraband in because that's why we're out here. So again, those work details could easily be under a lot of pressure to bring in stuff from the outside. Am I lying about that, Russ?
Oh no, that's huge, especially if you're talking about potentially larger jails, larger prisons. Someone throws out the window, just as your example, $30,000 or $40,000 worth of, let's say, black tar heroin, and they're not supposed to give that up. I mean, they're supposed to fight for that until the very end. And those people, throwing it out of the car probably aren't doing that out of the goodness of their heart either. So, they're telling these guys, hey, you know what? You're going to run that stuff in, and you're going to make me my profit, and you're going to get yours too. But you better not lose that contraband. So, you always have to be aware because then your numbers and chances for backup are pretty much that.
And what's funny for this next one, I wanted to put in the informal gathering. I know a lot of inmates sometimes get pissed off when the officer starts to see a group of them collect. May not be gangs or nothing, but just a group of them collecting in one area. And the officer may say after a couple minutes, hey, guys, got to break it up. Well, we're just chatting here. Guys, got to break it up. I have the informal social gatherings. This is something that dynamically form. And small social gatherings can quickly grow into strong alliances. Signs to watch for: regular gatherings, particularly around certain cell blocks or communal areas. And the intervention is limit informal gatherings. If problematic, encourage diverse group interactions and schedule routine patrols in communal areas. I mean, Russ, I always, always tell the officers, when I could, when I was a sergeant, if you saw them kind of group of them hanging out, break it up. After a minute, break it up, guys. Why? We'll just break it up, move around, whatever. Just, break it up. You guys are starting to get a bunch of people in this one area, and let's break it up. And the first thing they'll say is, we're not gang. Yeah, I get it. I know you're not gangs, but let's just break it up. Let's move it around. Let's not stay in one area, and let's keep it moving. That's maybe harder in like Podral Rex areas, because they're going to come out, but then sometimes you could kind of alternate how you let them out, so they're not always with those same individuals. But that's something that I feel has to be maintained by the officer. And again, the officers knows these individuals better than anyone at a managerial level. But what's your thoughts on those informal gatherings?
Yeah, we always just kind of like, if they started to get more than 3 or 4 together, we try and say, hey, you got too many. Sometimes that's hard because like sometimes they'd be watching, there might be 10 or 15 of them, watching a one-on-one basketball game or something like that. And so you do got to be cognizant of it. Sometimes there's reason to do something. Sometimes there's not. Sometimes you don't know. But it's always something to keep the eye on.
Yeah, and then it's funny because I know we're not giving people impossibilities. We know that these things are happening. We're just basically telling people to keep it monitored. I do have resentment towards authority figures. You could pretty much assume that there are many that could have that only because you hold their keys to freedom. So a lot of them don't want to be locked up. So there could be some.
They're conditioned. They're conditioned to it. They're conditioned by their environment. They're conditioned by their social circle. They're conditioned by what they see on television. A lot of them have bad experiences. Not very many of them, want to deal with me, especially, if I'm, busting them for having alcohol or dope or a tattoo gun. So, they tend to just be like that. They don't want the authority there in front of them. And that's just part of, they're all to a degree have, antisocial criminal personalities, not necessarily personality disorders, but antisocial criminal personalities. And so they are always going to, resent authority and authority figures. And that's everything from, us down at the lowest level to the jail commander to the warden and everyone else.
Yeah, and guys, you could also see this resentment of authority at a higher level when it comes to the disciplinary units, where there's just a shared experiences of discipline, and then the inmates just wind up connecting on their overall rowdiness. I got like inmates with similar disciplinary experiences may bond over mutual resentment to authority. So basically, if you got, maybe one inmate challenging the authority, then you got the other inmates cheering them on, and then eventually it's the next person doing it, and then you just wind up just building this unity just to kind of just mess with staff to some extent. You get splashed by one inmate, you may get splashed by 10 more. The signs to watch for is recurring discussions about disciplinary actions, bonding over shared punishment. Now think about that, guys. The unit itself, in which you have your disciplinary concerns, they're gonna bond over their discipline, because most of them are gonna think that they've been dealt with wrong. So they're all gonna share their experiences, build some connections, and ultimately those connections are gonna be rooted in a resentment for staff, because they're the ones that wrote them and brought them there. And then you got to rotate disciplinary action if needed, address issues directly with inmates, and offer counseling when possible. A little softer side, but Obviously there are certain things we always tell people, like, hey, that charge there, before you wrote them, did you try to address it? But then there's the charge that you gotta, there's no ifs and buts about it. They're going to be written up. And those are the more serious, obviously the more serious charges. But with that said, when you're in those disciplinary housing units, technically most of the time you are dealing with the higher level infractions. So you are dealing with the inmates that don't just break the rules, they break the highest level of rules. And now you're working those units, and I think the more problematic they are for staff in some cases, the more they all start to unite and cheer the next one on. And then you have this constant one up. And it's just a game that's played against staff, to where staff really is kind of like a cat and mouse, where you're never really ahead. You just got to try to maintain and get through the day. It's a very tough unit. And I think the reason why those units are extremely tough is because of how they unite on this shared experience of discipline. Now, even though it's locked and it's controlled, obviously danger could always occur. And for the most part, even though it's locked and controlled, a lot of these inmates will just break the rule just because they want to be a nuisance towards us. Now, the biggest concern is going to be how far they're going to go when they find that support amongst their own peers, and then the one-upping. Just the fact that, oh, Rush, you did that yesterday. What'd you do? You climbed through this and went through that. Okay, watch me today. So those are the units where, one, it's hectic, and two, your vigilance. I mean, you can't even blink in those type of units. What's your thoughts on that, Russ? The shared experience of discipline.
Yeah, and I think that it extends beyond just beyond discipline. They simply do not like being told what to do. They simply do not want to do what's expected of them. They do not want to be held accountable. So it's a larger penumbra around the discipline thing. And this is where when I am involved in doing the rehabilitation thing and the reentry thing, where you have to kind of disabuse these guys of their notions of that, because they always want to make an excuse. They always want to feel justified. They always want to have a reason. It's always someone else's fault. Well, the reason that happened is because the system sucks. The court sucks. My probation officer is a horrible person. And, that is the typical mindset that 98% of these guys have. And so you just have to know that you're up against an entrenched mindset like that because of the way that they innately are, which tends to be that antisocial personality facet, whether it's part of an actual disorder they have or just their overall general mindset.
Yeah, guys, you gotta remember something too. When you're walking into the prison, even though, as I said, if we do have problems, usually it's with a selected group, not all at once. The culture of the prison itself says no inmate should snitch. So granted, you already have the us versus them mentality already in play just by that alone, that the loyalty has to, if you're an inmate, your loyalty ultimately should go towards the inmate population. And if it doesn't, you will be taken out. So, I mean, there are some that even may not agree with it, but they're coerced or threatened to do so. So remember, the dynamic is there. And it's funny because the person, I've always told family members this, the person you think when they go to prison is not the person you know, or the person is not the person they're going to change when they get in the prison setting, because there's overwhelming pressure for them to change. And what's going to happen is it gets right down to their core of surviving. So when you got family, oh, there's no way my son would lie to me, whatever it is. Okay, maybe when he's not overwhelmed with pressures to do foolish shit, but when those pressures are there and the end result is he could be harmed, you'll be shocked what they'll tell you just to maintain their own survival. I put this down real quick, Russ, but it's just basically also I put down language and communication as unifiers. I think that's usually existing. A lot of even gangs that have their own terminology for things, whether it's built to kind of mess with criminal code or kind of mess with being investigated. They create little code words that got to be deciphered. But it does become language.
We see that a lot in California, amongst our population that are, we either refer to them or they refer to themselves as paises or other more structured like border brothers because they all speak Spanish. And so that can definitely be a unifier.
Yeah, I mean, border brothers, one with the guns on their hips, right?
Yeah. Some of them, I don't know. It's
22.
I think that's come along. Yeah. You see 22. They're more structured. Paises are just more like, I would call them more like Mexican countrymen. They're less structured, but they tend to kind of like run in the same circles. You get where you kind of like understand that there's a difference when you work around them all the time. But because there's a lot of little border factions that they're definitely not Sureños. But at the same time, they will definitely, well, not all of them. You got to be careful because you can't ever say anything definitively about what goes on in California. But I'll say, for the most part, they're at least somewhat friendly, sometimes in some ways, to the Sureños.
And guys, we did mention the unwritten rules and loyalty test. So basically, it's the culture of the population. It's a subculture where it kind of encourages obedience and solidarity. So we could skip that one because that's kind of related to the snitch stuff. I do have the storyteller and rumor, which Russ touched on before, the gossip networks or the stories of injustice. Guys, you got to be very wary of what happens in the streets because it will find its way into the prison. The George Floyd case could have caused a bit of an uproar. Russ had mentioned during his time the beating of Rodney King. Was a concern that leaked into the prison setting. So again, if it's happening in the neighborhood and they have a way to base it on some type of, in this case, ethnicity was a concern or equality or whatever it is, it's going to easily leak itself into the prison. But here's the bigger part of it all, though, and I think Russ would agree, is when we talk about stories of injustice or whether it's got whatever it is, they start to feel validated in doing it, because they feel that they're doing it for a greater cause.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be from outside either. You got to remember that, most prisons have, different units, and they'll hear about something that happened, even in their own unit. I mean, it can be something that they never saw, heard, touched, or anything else, and someone else did. And the next thing you know, there's a big, story about it. And it's completely wrong. Most of the time, I would say it's completely wrong every time, just about. So you never know. And you're right, man. Justification and validation and wanting an excuse to feel the way they do and to act out the way they do.
Yeah. And guys, the big thing about this is that, as I said, not even just keeping in touch with what's happening around you, the outside, the inside world, but also, be careful with this. But, you could try to stop the gossip, but also I would let your supervisor know what's being spread around and maybe have a little bit more of a strategic approach to it where, you hear gossip. I've done it where I heard something passed around and I may timely pick out a few people who I can deal with a little bit and say, hey, this is what we got going on. Is any strength to that? And just gauge the response. Not saying I trust in them 100%, but you can kind of gauge the response and you got to get it from somewhere. So you can kind of gauge the response and see if there may be some level of validity. I have, I put this in here. Give her to the Gossip Network. I've seen this. It's coordinating boundary testing. I got observing staff reactions to push limits, allow inmates to unify around shared observations. I think you could see that in disciplinary units 100%, where maybe by splashing, they see how staff react, or, hey, maybe I'll go through a cell extraction, just to get out of here. Or, hey, these couple of guys here, they keep on saying they're going to kill themselves, and that's how they remain in this unit. So now I'm going to say I'm going to kill myself, or I don't want a cellmate, so I'll assault, they're assaulting anyone that comes in. So I'm going to do the same. And, basically what they're doing is, in a way, they're testing the boundaries to see what they can get away with, but they're also maintaining control of the narrative. I think some of this here too is not just testing for control, but also testing to see what they can get away with or not based on the outcome. I want to be clear what I'm saying here, based on the outcome. inmates know that they're going to get written up for maybe some of the stuff that they're doing. As long as we hold them accountable, that's our job as officers, but we're not in control of the outcome. So having said that, if inmates start knowing that they can do this, sure, I'm going to get charged, but they may be saying, but hey, that's not the boundary I'm testing. I know the officer is going to charge me. I'm testing to see if it holds any weight with disciplinary. I'm testing to see if it holds any weight at all because I'm already in trouble. So what are they really going to do to me? So sometimes a lot of people only see the testing the boundary on that immediate level, but they may be testing the boundary because they know the officer is going to write them up, and now they want to kind of see how far they can go with it. See if it's going to be supported at the higher level. So testing boundaries could be at all levels, but just be careful because that's the Pandora's box effects. The Pandora's box is once you get an inmate that is able to get off scot-free on something and the outcome is they get what they want. So I don't know. I assaulted the inmate coming in. I've done it twice. So every time they go to put an inmate in, there's a fear that I'm going to assault the next one. So now the facility may have some liability now because, hey, every time we put somebody in there, he assaults somebody. So eventually there's a pattern here that we clearly see now based on the last couple of actions. So if we put another inmate in there and they get assaulted, someone's going to look up the pattern of how many times this other inmate assaults. But now this inmate that's doing the assault gets the single cell. They get the single cell because that's what they wanted. So now that's the boundary they tested ultimately to get the outcome that they wanted. And Russ, I'm sure you see that. I mean, that makes sense what I said at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's just this is one of those things that they do that. I don't know how much that gives them a point of unification because sometimes they'll see where there's a difference. Which officer they can manipulate the best, which officer they can get away with a certain situation. Maybe which lieutenant is better to have heard discipline and stuff. That's a little bit on the nuanced side. I'll say that.
Yeah, now Russ, let me go through these couple real quick, and we'll just speak them in groups because there's two last things. But instead of going one by one, let's just cover it down. So guys, we talked about what could cause unity. I think we covered a lot. I mean, nothing's ever all inclusive, but so these are some of the unjust behaviors that you'll see if unity forms. Okay, so obviously we got not in any order here, but I got targeting vulnerable inmates right here. Big concern here: resistance to staff orders. Let's see, what else do I got? Actually, to be honest with you, those are my two priorities for that one. Sorry, I thought I had a little bit more than that. I must have maybe deleted some, but I'm sure, Russ, you could think of some on the fly, right? But obviously, unity can cause a group dynamic that could put more vulnerable inmates at risk. I think that's a very big liability. And then obviously the biggest concern is the resistance to staff. The numbers could be very hard for staff to manage if the group dynamic is just increasing in number. So would you agree with all that, Russ? Anything else you want to add?
Those things, especially resistance to staff orders. I've been there many times. I've seen where, hey, they're refusing to go in their cells. They're refusing to, come off the yard. They're refusing to go on the yard. They're, doing all of these things to see where they can, make an impact. You'll see that, maybe they'll do like a hunger strike, like we saw with the short corridor up at Pelican Bay. And so all of those things, are just, ways that they're able to come together, unite, and try and change the dynamic or move the markers or whatever way you want to put it. And it just gives them a chance at leveraging a certain amount of power that they don't normally have access to.
Yeah. And guys, along this whole dialogue, we covered a lot of warning signs. But the two that I want to reiterate just one more time is the change in routine behaviors of individuals, but also the shift in the group dynamic or behaviors as well. So, I mean, those are just, we talked about many signs throughout the whole process based on what it was that was causing the unity. So let me just get rid of that. And the last part I got is basically when it comes to balance and security and inmate cohesion. You You got to have effective intervention. I want to mention something here with this. And the other thing is positive forms of unity. Okay, so wait, I want to mention something with the effective intervention. There's a, I was taught that there's a point where, what's the beginning part? One is prevent, then the next step is intervene, and the last step is suppress. I think sometimes when the threat is high, some people still expect us to intervene when it's time to suppress. Definitely not time to prevent. And I think people need to understand those three layers. In definitely in the context of group behaviors or unity, is there are times when we're walking the unit, whatever it is, and I mean maybe I'm in the juvenile justice center, I don't know, and I could prevent these kids. Fine, maybe there's a way I can isolate and prevent. But when you start getting to these adult settings and the dynamic, it's all around you. Different groups, as we just mentioned, that could unify at pretty much. The prevention there is pretty much it's going to be very non-existent because the dynamic exists. It's the culture of the prison. It's spread out through the individuals, and so your job at that point really is to be active at intervening. I mean that's your initial at the lowest level. So when you're at that prison level, the lowest level is not preventing. The lowest level is the mid-level to me. It's intervention. They're already going to be involved. It's the dynamic of the facility, So my thing is I'm looking to intervene. And if intervention doesn't work, then you suppress. It's these two levels. And I know that, some people may want to see the softer side of it all. But in corrections, unity is so dangerous that there's no effort to negotiate. It's not. And I say intervention and I say suppression because it puts the power in our hands, where preventing really doesn't. Preventing really gives the power to the individual. Are you going to not do it or are you going to do it? Like that's on you. But when it comes to intervening, I'm grabbing you. I'm taking control, and suppression is we're all on top. So I think when it comes to the prison setting, I'd rather lean towards the latter two. And then the positive forms of unity is just, I understand inmates need to have a voice, of course. And there's no way we at this dialogue ever denied the fact that there is a concern. They need to be able to bring it up. But they need to be professional. The cause has to be legit. Something that's not born out of selfish reasons, but something that needs to be done, something that could relate to a right, of course, which hopefully it doesn't get to that point because we know our jobs and we handle it. But I don't care if it starts becoming violent, if it starts becoming disruptive. I'll be honest with you, at this point here, I may want to know what caused it, but that's not going to stop me or our team from acting the way we got to do to suppress it. That's all I'm saying. The only reason why I want to know is so it doesn't happen again. But once they start crossing into disruptive or threatening behavior, their reason could be 100% whatever it is. But the way they carried it out, once you put the life of anybody at risk, I'll be honest with you. I may want to know what the reason was, but it's not to go ahead and minimize how I'm going to address it. It's still going to be some level of suppression and zero tolerance. Russ, what's your thoughts? Positive. And what about the intervention aspect, the intervention suppression?
Once we're that far, we're just going in. That's it's already gone too far. As far as positive aspects of it, the problem with the positive aspects is that you extend that beyond one or two individuals. And we're not concerned usually about one or two individuals having unity, but you get beyond that and someone's going to ruin it for all of them because someone is going to take the low road every time in corrections. Every time.
Yeah, and I want to mention, you made a good point. I like what you just said there. And I also want to mention something too, guys. The positive in regards to unity is not going to be subjective. It's not. It's not. It's going to be what needs to be done, and it's not being done. I mean, sometimes I've seen inmates' voices actually help staff become more effective. because the inmates may have a greater way to get resources back into the facility. So, I mean, there could be greater good to that. But once it starts falling into selfish needs, but disguised as greater good, that's when the experts have to come in and tell you, hey, you're being played. I think that's the biggest concern, too, is when you have this guise that it's for positive, but staff is sitting there and they know that don't let the inmate play you. It has nothing to do with any of that. They're starting that like, oh, we want this because I need that for rehabilitation. So I know you cut off contact with my family because I got caught smuggling in whatever it is, but I need to have my contact because I need to rehabilitate. No, should have thought about that. That was your fault, not mine. So you should have thought about that before you started bringing stuff in. Sometimes they'll guise the greater good under a selfish motive, and that's where you need the correctional staff to come in and say, hey, hold on. On the surface, I get why you want to do that. I get it. But let me tell you why the inmate is really trying to do that. Because most of the time, I'm going to be honest with you, most of the time it's easy because ultimately you'll see that they may post something that you feel is for the whole population. But if you really look a little bit deeper, the only person that's going to benefit from it is the individual who's bringing it to your attention. Hey, Russ, anything you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, I think that we really got, we really got into the nitty gritty of this thing. There's a lot to take away. I hope that people use this in their training. I hope that they think about it. If I walk away with just giving you 4 quick things that unity is generally built around at the tactical level. Number 1 is problems with food. Number 2 is a lack of access to good recreation of all kinds. Number 3 is lack of good quality medical care. And number 4 is lack of a robust grievance procedure that, protects their due process and their rights. So those are the things that I always look out for, that I always wanted to immediately, intervene on. And so if I was just going to distill it down to the simplest quick lesson I could give, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I love that, Russ. And guys, just my closing is just, it was a good dialogue. We put it together. I mean, is it all inclusive? I mean, I don't know, but it's a good foundation. Good things for you to notice if you happen to be working in those units. But I will tell you one thing. The big bulk of this is really on our frontline professionals. I mean, we'll usually find out about on the higher level when it's been exhausted or the attempts have been exhausted. But if you really want to get it at that level as soon as you can, you got to be out there on the floor, moving around and seeing what's happening. And people, it's good to have these discussions because people don't understand how complex our job is. This is one of a million things that we have to monitor and keep lookout of, and just on top of many other things. And it's good for us to have these videos so people can see that we're not just simple guards. So these guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.